She was 9 years old. She weighed barely 60 pounds. On the biting cold afternoon of March 6th, 1959, she walked out of her front door carrying 7 small boxes of mints, and she never came home. This is not a story about a child who simply wandered off and got lost in the woods. This is a story about a predator, a monster who deliberately chose the smallest, most harmless target on the street. And it would take 62 years, 3 entire generations of detectives, and a single glass jar sitting untouched in a dusty evidence locker to finally pull him out of the shadows. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that Friday afternoon. Because to truly understand the sheer magnitude of what was lost, you first have to understand who Candy Rogers was. Spokane, Washington, in 1959 was a different world entirely. It was the kind of place where kids walked to school alone, where neighbors left their front doors unlocked without a second thought. West Central Spokane was a quiet, working-class neighborhood built on modest homes and familiar faces. It was the kind of street where everybody knew your name. Nobody watched the clock when children went outside to play. There was simply no reason to. Candy lived in a cozy apartment above a neighborhood grocery store on the 2000 block of West Mission Avenue. She lived there with her mother, Elaine, who worked as a high school history and physical education teacher. Her grandparents lived right next door, a constant, comforting presence in her life. She had a faithful dog named Shep. She was exceptionally small for her age, standing just 4'4" and weighing a fragile 60 pounds. She was shy by nature, the kind of quiet kid who easily blended into the background. But she was a bluebird, the junior level of the Campfire Girls of America, and that meant the absolute world to her. It gave her a sense of purpose. It gave her something to work toward with pure, unfiltered childhood enthusiasm. March 6, 1959, was a massive day in Candy's world. It was the official opening of the Campfire mint selling season. Candy got out of school at 3:15 p.m. By 3:30, she was already at her troop leader's house, eagerly picking up her inventory. She had a plan. She was going to sell enough mints to earn her sales badge and put herself in the running for a free week of summer camp. Because she was so small, she could only carry 7 boxes at a time. Anything more would slip from her tiny hands. She brought them home and waited. The official start time to begin knocking on doors was exactly 4 p.m. In that agonizingly slow half hour, she sat at the kitchen table with her grandmother, happily eating an oatmeal cookie. She rolled around on the floor with Shep. She chattered endlessly about which neighbors she was going to visit first, and who would definitely buy a box. There was no hesitation in her voice. She wasn't nervous. She was practically glowing with excitement. At exactly 4 p.m., Candy Rogers stepped out into the freezing March air and started knocking on doors. In the Pacific Northwest, early March means the darkness falls fast and heavy. By 5:40 p.m., the streetlights began to hum and flicker on, casting long, unnatural shadows across the pavement. Candy knew the golden rule: be home before the lights came on. So when 5:30 drifted past with no sign of her, her grandfather felt the first cold prickle of unease. He threw on his coat and went outside to look. He checked with the neighbors. He walked the length of the block. Nobody had seen her. Her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment, only to walk straight into a suffocating nightmare. Within the hour, frantic family members were scouring the darkening streets. By nightfall, the police were called. But there was a paralyzing problem. There were dozens of other Campfire girls out that evening, dozens of little girls in the exact same uniforms, carrying the exact same boxes. It made tracing Candy's specific path nearly impossible. Witnesses thought they saw her, but they couldn't be absolutely sure. Then, around 9 p.m., searchers found something in the dark that shattered every ounce of hope. On Pettit Drive, a steep road climbing a hill known locally as Doomsday Hill, boxes of Campfire mints were found scattered across the freezing ground. They weren't just dropped, they were scattered, smashed. Some looked as though they had been violently thrown from the window of a moving car as it sped away into the night. The trail of broken boxes led south, moving across the Fort George Wright Bridge, leading further and further away from Candy's neighborhood. One single box held a partial fingerprint. It was carefully lifted, preserved, and sent straight to the FBI. It was never identified. By 9 p.m. on March 6, 1959, the city of Spokane understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. Someone had taken her. The horrifying question was who and why this little girl, out of all the children on the street that night. The answer was hiding in plain sight. But it would take 62 years to find it. By the morning of March 7th, every single person in Spokane knew that Candy Rogers was missing, and over 12,000 of them showed up to find her. 12,000 people for one little girl. Marines, Boy Scouts, utility workers, mail carriers, people on horseback. They all descended on west central Spokane before the sun even came up. A command post was hastily set up at the exact intersection where her crushed mint boxes had been found. The U.S. Air Force dispatched helicopters to scan the freezing river and the dense, unforgiving woods. You have to remember the era. They had no cell phones, no GPS tracking, no security cameras on front porches. They had nothing but a trail of cardboard, an unidentified fingerprint, and a path that vanished at the edge of a bridge. The desperation to find her was absolute, and it led to another devastating tragedy. Just one day into the search, an Air Force helicopter flying low over the river struck high-tension power lines and violently crashed into the water below. 3 crew members were killed on impact. Airman Marles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 2 others miraculously survived. 3 men died searching for one child. The city was now bleeding in 2 directions at once, and Candy was still gone. The days that followed were suffocating. Tips flooded in from across the country by the thousands, and exhausted detectives chased down every single lead. They contacted anyone with a relevant criminal history, but in 1959, there was no sex offender registry to pull from. Several suspects were developed, interrogated, and ultimately cleared. None could be tied to Candy with hard evidence. 16 agonizing days dragged by. Then, on March 21st, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting in the woods off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's home. As they moved through the dense trees near an abandoned rock quarry, they noticed something completely out of place, sitting at the base of a pine tree. A pair of small girls' shoes. They hadn't been dropped in a panic. They had been deliberately, almost ritualistically placed there. The men rushed back to the base and reported it immediately. The next morning, a search party arrived at daybreak. Within minutes, one of the searchers pushed aside a heavy pile of brush and dead pine needles and found Candy Rogers. She had been hidden under branches, 50 yards off the main road. Retired Spokane Police Captain Richard Obering was one of the officers who found her that morning. He would carry the horror of that image for the rest of his life. The cause of death was strangulation. The weapon used to end her life was a strip of cloth torn directly from Candy's own slip, the very garment she had been wearing when she left home so full of excitement. Her feet had been bound with another piece of that same slip. There was a dark bruising mark around her waist, suggesting she may have been tied with a rope at some point, but no rope was ever found at the scene. When the medical examiners conducted their work, they discovered evidence of a horrific physical violation, a dark, brutal reality that shattered the innocence of the entire city and added a sickening layer of horror to the crime. The investigators back in 1959 had absolutely no idea what future technology would be capable of. They didn't know what DNA was. but they meticulously cataloged and preserved every single piece of evidence anyway. The discovery of her body changed Spokane in ways that lasted for generations. Parents who had never thought twice about letting their kids walk to the store now watched them like hawks from behind locked doors. The name Candy Rogers became a generational warning, a ghost story whispered by mothers to keep their daughters close. The police had evidence. They had biological material they didn't yet know how to use. They hoped that science would eventually hand them an answer. But before that could happen, a known serial killer was about to walk into the investigation and send the entire police department chasing shadows for the next 4 decades. For 40 years, Spokane detectives believed they knew exactly who killed Candy. They had a name, a history, and a piece of evidence that seemed to point directly at one man. The case felt completely solid. It was entirely wrong. And here is what makes it so much worse. The real killer had never appeared in a single tip. He was never mentioned in a witness statement. His name wasn't in a single police report spanning 62 years of investigation. While detectives chased the wrong man, the real monster lived quietly in the exact same city, raised a family, and died before anyone ever thought to look in his direction. The man they hunted was named Hugh Beyond Morse. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, the kind of predator who moved through the community without raising immediate alarm. When Candy went missing, Morse actually showed up to help search. He walked those freezing streets alongside grieving neighbors and determined officers, pretending to look for a little girl he almost certainly already knew was dead. He lived just a couple of blocks from Candy's home. And 4 years before her murder, he had been picked up in California for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts selling cookies door to door. A chilling, exact echo of what happened to Candy. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, then went on a cross-country killing spree, committing at least 7 more violent crimes before being caught. The profile fit Candy's case almost perfectly. He preyed on young girls selling things door to door. He was in the area. And then there was the gum. Hugh Morse had a bizarre habit. At almost every single crime scene, investigators found grape-flavored gum. It was consistent enough across multiple locations that it became a known signature linking him to his crimes. During Candy's autopsy in 1959, a detective noted a strange purple stain on her clothing. When examined closely, it had a faint grape smell. That single, untested observation took on a life of its own. As Morse's profile as a serial killer became clearer over the years, that grape stain became the undeniable centerpiece of the case against him. It was an assumption that hardened into near certainty, pointing every subsequent investigation in the wrong direction for 40 years. Then came the year 2001. Detective Mindy Connolly finally submitted Candy's clothing to a forensic lab. Scientists managed to isolate a semen sample from the preserved evidence and built a full DNA profile. It was the very first time in 42 years that investigators had anything beyond circumstantial suspicion. They tested it directly against Hugh Morse. It did not match. The grape stain, the parallel crimes, the geography, none of it mattered. The DNA said no. The profile was immediately uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database. 0 hits, complete deafening silence. The real killer had never been arrested for anything requiring a DNA sample in the database. In 62 years, his name had not appeared once. He had been right there the entire time, hiding in the shadows, and nobody had ever looked at him. There is one reason, and only one reason, that this case was ever solved. Not the modern detectives, not the advanced technology, not the cutting-edge lab in Texas. All of those things mattered, but none of them would have worked without a single, quiet decision made by an unknown investigator back in 1959, long before DNA testing even existed. Someone took Candy's underwear, folded it carefully, placed it inside a glass mason jar, and sealed it completely shut. That jar is the only thread that connects a 9-year-old girl murdered in 1959 to a confirmed DNA match in 2021. Glass does not degrade. Glass does not absorb moisture. It does not interact with the biological material stored inside. That airtight seal, created in an era with no reason to think about genetic evidence, created a near-perfect preservation environment. When forensic scientists finally twisted the lid off that jar in the early 2000s, the DNA inside wasn't just present. It was strong enough to build a full profile. The detectives in 1959 could not have possibly known what they were saving, but they saved it anyway. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her parents told her about Candy Rogers, not as a tragic news story, but as a stern warning. Watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl. The case was woven into the very fabric of how Spokane parents raised their children. Wright eventually grew up to become a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division, and in 2018, when the Spokane Police Department began reassessing its oldest cold cases, Candy's file landed right on her desk. The timing was everything. In 2018, California investigators used a revolutionary new technique called forensic genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer, a monster who had evaded capture for 40 years. The technique worked by running crime scene DNA through consumer ancestry databases to find distant relatives, building family trees until the search narrowed to a single name. The moment that arrest made international news, law enforcement agencies across the country pulled out their oldest, dustiest boxes and asked, "Could this work for us?" Spokane asked that exact question about Candy immediately. But there was a massive problem. The DNA sample, while miraculously preserved in that jar, had still degraded over 60 long years. It was also burdened with non-human contamination. In 2020, Wright submitted the last of the sample to a private genealogy laboratory. They sent it back. Too degraded, they said. They declined the case entirely. That rejection was the end of the road. CODIS had returned nothing. Every traditional lead was dead. If genealogy could not be done with what remained, Candy's case was effectively closed forever. Then Wright heard about a laboratory in Texas called Othram. They specialized in exactly the kind of impossible work other labs turned away, utilizing a proprietary method built specifically for degraded, near-depleted biological samples. In February 2021, Wright packaged up what remained of the evidence, down to the very last microscopic drops, and shipped it to Texas. Othram went to work. They successfully built a genealogical profile and ran it through an ancestry database. The results narrowed the entire population down to 3 brothers, all deceased, all from Spokane: John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, and Terry Allen Hoff. Genealogy cannot distinguish between brothers because their DNA looks nearly identical in a family tree. To identify which specific brother had left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed a living relative. And only one of the 3 brothers had children. Detective Storment picked up the phone and made a call to a woman who had spent her entire life believing her father died because he was severely depressed. She had absolutely no idea what was coming. In 62 years of exhaustive investigation, John Ray Hoff's name had never appeared in a single police report. Not as a suspect, not as a witness, not even as a passing mention in the margins. As Detective Storment plainly stated, he simply wasn't on their radar at all. Until September 6, 2021, the day everything finally unraveled. When Storment called Kathy Hoff, he identified himself as a cold case investigator who desperately needed her help. Within 45 minutes of hanging up that phone, she walked through the doors of the Spokane police headquarters. But she already knew. She hadn't just sat waiting passively after the mysterious call. She had immediately gone online. She had searched his name, the city, the year. Somewhere in those 45 minutes, she had found the tragic story of a 9-year-old girl murdered while selling campfire mints. She walked into that interrogation room already carrying the crushing weight of what she suspected. Kathy volunteered her DNA without a single moment of hesitation. The results came back on September 8th. The DNA recovered from the cloth that killed Candy was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy than to any random person on Earth. Her father was the man who left that DNA, but investigators weren't done. John Hoff was long dead. There would be no trial, no fierce cross-examination, no defense attorneys. That meant the burden of absolute certainty rested entirely on the shoulders of the detectives. They needed to be as sure as modern science could possibly make them. They obtained a warrant and exhumed John Ray Hoff's body from the earth on September 23, 2021. The final, indisputable result came back on October 1st. The probability that the DNA from Candy's clothing belonged to Hoff rather than an unrelated person was 25 quintillion to 1. The number 25, followed by 18 zeros. That is not a number that leaves even a microscopic fraction of room for doubt. The case was solved. John Ray Hoff was born in August 1938 right there in Spokane. He wasn't a transient drifter passing through town. He was local. He was known. He was familiar. His early life showed the dark warning signs that, in hindsight, form a terrifyingly recognizable pattern. At 16, he escaped from a state juvenile reform facility. That brush with the law pushed him into the military, and he was assigned to the missile sites protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, right outside his own city. On the day Candy vanished, he lived just 1 mile away from her home. 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested for second-degree assault. What he had done was chilling. He grabbed a woman off the street, forcibly removed her clothing, tied her up using her own garments, and began strangling her before he suddenly fled into the night. She survived. He used his victim's own clothing to bind her. He used her own clothing to strangle her. It was an exact, horrifying match to what was done to Candy Rogers. The ligature around Candy's neck was torn from her own slip. Her ankles were bound with another strip of the same garment. The only difference was that the 1961 victim survived because something interrupted him. Candy did not. Hoff served a pathetic 6 months for that attack. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army and spent the next few years drifting between dead-end jobs, selling cutlery door to door, working at a lumber yard, putting time in at a meat packing plant. He wasn't a man building a life. He was a predator, hiding in the open. And then there is the one detail about John Hoff that cuts deeper and bleeds more than all the others combined. Hoff had a stepsister. In 1959, she was 10 years old. She was a Campfire girl. In fact, she was Candy Rogers' officially assigned big sister in the program, the older girl whose specific job was to guide and protect the younger Bluebird. She knew Candy personally. She cared about Candy deeply. When Candy disappeared and the entire city fell apart searching for her, this 10-year-old girl was completely devastated. She sat on the couch next to her older brother, next to John Hoff, and wept uncontrollably. She told him how much she missed her little Campfire sister. She told him how terrified she was, how terrible the whole thing was. And John Hoff sat there. He looked at her crying. He listened to her sob over the little girl he had just slaughtered. And he said absolutely nothing. John Ray Hoff died in 1970, long before anyone could hold him accountable in a court of law. He took his own life. but the date he chose to pull the trigger is a detail that lingers like a dark, suffocating shadow over the entire case. He did it on his own daughter's birthday, the exact day she turned 9 years old, the exact same age Candy Rogers was when he abducted and murdered her. Whether that was an act of overwhelming guilt, a sick coincidence, or something profoundly darker, he took that answer to the grave. And when investigators went to find out exactly where that grave was, they discovered something that made the entire room go dead quiet. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff was buried in the exact same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The little girl he stole from the street, the child he strangled with her own clothing, she was buried there, and so was he, just yards away, for over 5 decades. While her grieving family visited her grave, weeping and wondering who had done this to her, her killer lay rotting in the exact same ground, in the same silence, in the same city, and nobody knew. When Detective Storment had to sit down and tell Hoff's surviving family what the DNA had definitively confirmed, the fallout was catastrophic. He described it at the press conference with a heavy heart. I took those people's lives in their childhood and dumped it on its head. He was not being dramatic. Kathy Hoff had spent her entire life believing the tragedy of her father was simply that he struggled with depression. That was the story the family carried to make sense of losing him. And in one single conversation with a cold case detective, that story was violently replaced by something no one could have ever prepared for. The grief didn't disappear. It just mutated into something far more complicated and agonizing. But when Hoff's family learned that he was buried in the same cemetery as Candy, they made a decision without ever being asked. They immediately arranged to have his remains dug up and moved to an entirely different cemetery, so that Candy, as Storment put it, could finally enjoy some peace. When Candy's family heard what they had done, her cousin Joanne was overcome with emotion. That gesture from the killer's family to the victim's family was not justice, but it was the only thing they had the power to give. And then there is still the matter of Hoff's stepsister. She is in her 70s now. After the case was officially closed, Detective Storment tracked her down to tell her what her brother had done. She was, in his words, absolutely heartbroken. She told the detective how clearly she remembered sitting next to John Hoff, crying over losing Candy, telling him how devastated she was and how much she missed her little Campfire sister. He had sat there, listened to her, and said absolutely nothing. She had spent her entire life carrying that grief as an innocent bystander, never knowing that the monster responsible for it was sitting right beside her, absorbing her tears without a single flinch. Kathy Hoff gave a videotaped statement that was played at the final press conference. She didn't hide. She didn't deflect. She looked directly into the camera and said, "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives her peace knowing that even though it's not really justice, because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved." That statement is worth sitting with. There would be no trial, no prison sentence, no dramatic courtroom moment where the law looked John Hoff in the eye and called him exactly what he was. He had already escaped that. But Kathy was offering the only thing that remained: acknowledgement. His name attached permanently to what he did. The record corrected. The truth finally put on paper. It is not justice, but it is not nothing. At that press conference, retired Captain Richard Obering sat quietly in the audience. He was one of the officers who had pushed aside the brush and pine needles to find Candy's body on March 22, 1959. He had carried the horrific image of what John Hoff had left behind for 62 years. Now an old man, he was still alive to finally hear the answer. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormont, visibly emotional, was asked how many hours had been invested in the Candy Rogers investigation over the past 6 decades. He shook his head. He didn't give a number. He said, "This isn't measured in hours. This is measured in careers." 3 generations of detectives had worked this case. 3 generations had handed the file forward with the exact same silent plea: don't give up on her. The last generation did not. Candy's cousin Joanne wiped tears from her face and said simply, "I feel like Candy's loss was just a horrible loss. She was so cute, and she didn't have much time. She didn't have much time." Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She wanted to earn a badge. She had a dog named Shep, a grandmother who gave her oatmeal cookies, and a whole street full of neighbors she was so excited to visit. She had a future that belonged to her by absolute right, and it was violently taken from her on a cold Friday afternoon in March by a 20-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away and was never once suspected. We will never know who she would have become. But what we do know is this: she mattered enough that 1,200 people showed up to find her in the freezing cold. She mattered enough that 3 generations of detectives absolutely refused to close her file. She mattered enough that a forensic scientist who grew up hearing her name as a ghost story sent one last microscopic sample to one last lab, refusing to accept that the answer was gone forever. And she mattered enough that the daughter of her killer looked directly into a camera and made sure the entire world knew his name and what he did with it. 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days. That is exactly how long Candy Rogers waited. The clock has finally stopped. This case leaves us with questions that are almost impossible to shake. How many other cold cases from the 1950s and 60s still have biological evidence sitting in a dusty evidence locker right now, just waiting for the technology that already exists to finally give them an answer? John Hoff committed a nearly identical, brutal assault in 1961 and served just 6 months. If that sentence had actually reflected the true danger he posed to society, would Candy Rogers' case have ever needed to be solved? And what does it really mean for justice when the absolute only punishment a killer ever faces is having his name permanently attached to what he did, long after he is already in the ground? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Which part of this tragic story hit you the hardest? Your support means everything and keeps us digging into the cases that refuse to be forgotten. If you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below.